Today we are going to discuss World War II in the Pacific Theater. Pearl Harbor was a naval base in the then territory of Hawaii. On December 7, 1941, the U.S. Pacific Fleet was anchored there. Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was the commander-in-chief of the Japanese fleet during World War II and mastermind of the attack on Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, while most of the American sailors were still asleep, Japanese planes started to fly over Pearl Harbor, bombing every ship in sight. It lasted less than 2 hours, and 2,400 Americans were killed, 20 warships were sunk or damaged, and 150 airplanes were destroyed. This attack on the U.S. forced FDR to sign a declaration of war against Japan. Since Japan was aligned with the Axis powers, Germany also declared war on the United States. This pulled the U.S. into fighting in Germany. The majority of those who lost their lives in the attack on Pearl Harbor were in the USS Arizona. 1,100 sailors lost their lives when it sank. The Pearl Harbor Memorial was built over the top of the USS Arizona as a tribute to those who were still buried in the ship. In 1942, it was mainly the Americans fighting the Japanese in the Pacific. By 1942, Japanese troops had already occupied Korea, Eastern China, the Philippines, British Burma and Malay, French Indochina, the Dutch East Indies, and most of the small Pacific islands west of the American-owned Midway Island. The main way the U.S. paid for World War II was through the buying of wartime bonds. Bond buying was a way to finance the war just as it had done in a few decades before in World War I. One of the first major battles between the U.S. and Japan occurred in the Philippines. The U.S. owned the Philippines at this point. The battle was a very decisive and major victory for the Japanese. This attack on the Philippines occurred within hours of the Pearl Harbor attack. After 3 months of fighting, the Japanese started to transfer 76,000 Americans and Filipino prisoners of war from the Bataan Peninsula. This march was characterized by physical abuse and murder of the prisoners of war. It is thought that between 5,000 to 10,000 Filipino and 600 to 650 Americans died on the march. The U.S. wanted to get within striking distance of Japan. They participated in a strategy known as island hopping. The idea was to bypass Japanese strongholds and isolate them with naval and air power. One of the first major island hopping battles was the Battle of Coral Sea. Although sort of a draw between the Japanese and American forces, it was seen as a strategic victory for the U.S. since they were able to stop the Japanese for the first time. The Battle of Midway was one of the most important naval battles of the Pacific Campaign. This was a decisive defeat of the Japanese. One of the breakthroughs that made this possible was the American code breakers. One way the Japanese would fight back against the Americans were their use of kamikazes. This was the practice of Japanese fighter pilots who would cause suicide attacks on U.S. ships by aiming their planes at the ships. The majority of these attacks took place at the Battle of Okinawa. In 1944, as America was starting to gain ground on the Japanese, General MacArthur returned to the Philippines in order to try to take control over it. Some of the fiercest fighting in the Pacific Campaign came in the Battle of Iwo Jima. 6,812 Americans and 21,844 Japanese were killed. This was a decisive victory for the Americans. The new Big Three met in Potsdam to finalize the peace terms for Germany and discuss what to do with Japan. It was known that the U.S. wanted an unconditional surrender, but the Japanese would not agree to that. They were very concerned with what would happen to their emperor and would defend him to the last Japanese civilian. One way that was being discussed was the Manhattan Project that was taking place in Los Alamos, New Mexico. The project was started under FDR in 1942. The director of the project was J. Robert Oppenheimer. The idea was to build an atomic bomb that would be a very lethal weapon. It was originally thought to be used to end the war in Germany, but the project was not complete before the end of war in Europe. The next target was Japan. 2 bombs were made, Little Boy and Fat Man. The idea was to drop the bomb on a major Japanese city and then demand unconditional surrender. The first bomb was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. The Japanese still refused to surrender unconditionally. The U.S. forces dropped the second atomic bomb on Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. Many people suffered from the radiation exposure that occurred in those days. Finally, on September 2, 1945, the Japanese surrendered after an agreement was reached that would allow the emperor to remain on the throne as the head of state.